Hi, I'm Rachel Geertz, Technical Advisor here at Gouchon Brothers. Today we're going to be talking about how temperature impacts West System epoxy. Epoxy cures through an exothermic reaction, which means it generates heat as it cures. Too much heat, and it can have an uncontrolled exothermic reaction, causing the epoxy to yellow, smoke, and even crack. On the other side of the coin, epoxy needs enough heat to cure properly. If the temperatures are too cold, the epoxy doesn't have enough energy to cross-link properly. When considering the impacts of temperature on the epoxy, you want to consider 3 different temperatures. First, the temperature of the epoxy while it's still in the can. Second, the substrate temperature, the temperature of the surface that you're applying the epoxy to. And third is the temperature of the environment. 2 common examples of environments include a climate-controlled workshop, where the temperature of the epoxy, the substrate, and the air are all fairly similar. Another example would be working outside, in which you might have the greatest variance between the temperature of the product, the substrate, and the air. Keep in mind that the epoxy and the substrate are going to change temperature a lot slower than the air. The primary method we recommend using to control the impact of temperature on the epoxy's cure speed is to select the proper hardener. Do not attempt to adjust the epoxy's cure speed by altering mix ratios. This will prevent the epoxy from curing properly. The 105 resin with the 205 fast hardener will cure down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, where the 105 resin with the 206 slow hardener will cure down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And finally, our 105 resin with our 209 extra slow hardener will cure down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. For cold temperature applications, we recommend using our 105 resin with our 205 fast hardener, since it cures down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. We also have some specialty epoxies that will cure down to cold temperatures, including our G-Flex, which will cure down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and our 610, which will cure down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's important to keep in mind that temperature impacts the handling properties of epoxy. At colder temperatures, the viscosity of the epoxy will increase, so it may be more difficult to dispense the epoxy. It also may not release air as easily when mixing it. And if you have an application which requires you to use filler, you may not need as much filler because the base viscosity is already higher. Another handling characteristic that's impacted by temperature is cure speed. Epoxy cures slower at lower temperatures. We have a general rule of thumb here at West System that for every 18-degree temperature change, you're going to affect the cure speed of the epoxy by a factor of 2. A great example of this is if you were to use 105 resin with 205 fast hardener at 72 degrees, you'd see a pot life of about 10 minutes. Now, if that same mixed epoxy was taken down to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, you'd get a 20-minute pot life. Although it's rare, our 105 resin can crystallize, especially when temperatures fluctuate around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The good news is, those crystals can be redissolved by heating the epoxy to about 125 degrees Fahrenheit and stirring occasionally. Once all the crystals are dissolved, you can still use the product for structural applications. Now that we understand the impact of cold temperatures on epoxy, we can discuss how to minimize their impact. Epoxy readily takes the temperature of the substrate that it's applied to. Therefore, it may be in your best interest to warm that surface before beginning your project. To warm the surface, you can use heat lamps or space heaters. We don't recommend using unventilated open flame heat sources as they can contaminate your surface. We do recommend setting up appropriate heat sources several hours before you begin your project so that the substrate can be thoroughly warmed. When working outside, especially on a large repair area, it may be best to tarp off the area to contain the heat. It's important to keep in mind that with any of these techniques, porous materials such as wood can outgas. This means that air can work its way out of the porous material and into your epoxy, creating micro air bubbles. To prevent this, it's best to slightly decrease the temperature while applying the epoxy, making sure to remain above the minimum cure temperature of the system. Now that we've talked about how to use the resin and hardener in cold temperatures, we can talk about how to use them in hot temperatures. Many of these same tips and techniques apply, only in reverse. Firstly, when working at warmer temperatures, we want to make sure that we're selecting the appropriate hardener. You may want to use our 209 extra slow hardener. Our 105 resin with our 209 extra slow hardener is especially helpful for working over dark colored surfaces as they can get especially hot in the sun. Just remember that when using the 105 resin and 209 extra slow hardener, your project needs to stay above 70 degrees, the minimum cure temperature. If you're working in the 70 to 80 degree temperature range, it may be better to use our 105 resin with our 206 slow hardener. This offers a minimum cure temperature of 60 degrees and ample working time when working in the 70 to 80 degree Fahrenheit temperature range. You can increase the working time with either of these hardeners by storing them at a moderate temperature before beginning your project. You can also mix small batches, which allows for less heat generation of the epoxy. You can pour the product into a shallow pan, such as a roller pan, which will help dissipate the heat that the epoxy is generating into the environment, further controlling the temperature of the epoxy. Additionally, you can create a cool box by using insulative foam and coating it with epoxy to make it watertight. Then you can fill the box with tap water to ensure that the heat generated by the epoxy is pulled away, allowing you to have a longer working time with it. Keep in mind that when working in warm temperatures, your recoat window will also be affected. We can use the general rule of thumb that for every 18 degrees Fahrenheit temperature change, we're going to affect the cure speed of the epoxy by a factor of 2. That means if we're used to using the 105 resin with the 206 slow hardener at 72 degrees in a thin film, we might be used to a 2-hour working time. But if you suddenly are working at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, it's only going to give you about 1 hour to work with it in a thin film. Just like how temperature impacts the cure speed of the epoxy, it also impacts the viscosity. At higher temperatures, you're going to see that the epoxy has a lower viscosity. If you're working on a project which you need a thickened epoxy, you may need to add more filler to get to that same consistency. It's also important to note that the epoxy is curing more quickly, so you may want to do a test batch to see how much filler you need to add to get to the correct consistency and make sure to maximize your working time with the product. We hope this helps you understand how temperature impacts working with epoxy and allows you to better adapt to changing temperatures during your epoxy project. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our technical service team.